Okay, this video is going to look at an ideological critical approach and meaning in Under the Skin. It's a companion piece to the Moon video we looked at, and we're not going to look at narrative today, but we will address that in our future lessons. So once again, this is about ideology and meaning, and also representation of gender. Okay, so that's study areas. Now before we start, on the website there's an article called Science Fiction and Bodies of the Future, Alternative Gender Realities in Hollywood Cinema. And there's a picture on the screen, but there's a great quote that starts this study that I think contextualizes our study of not only sci-fi but Under the Skin. And they say the science fiction genre has traditionally exemplified alternative forms of sexuality and or gender identities, providing with the ideal forum for any criticism on gender biased societies and behaviours. So what this article is arguing and pointing out is that yes, film is a vehicle that explores social issues, but science fiction is unique, and in particular it's unique in the way it can deal with issues of gender and the prevailing attitudes of our time because of the what if scenario. Basically looks at our society and extrapolates into the future. And obviously we live in a time when technology and AI is a big deal, and we're on the cusp of artificial intelligence. So these films on the bottom basically explore that, but they explore it through the relationship between humans and robots, in particular sexual and romantic relationships. And I find it quite interesting, and that's basically what Under the Skin is. Okay, so what's interesting about this film is that obviously Scarlett Johansson stars in it. It may seem like a role that's not really part of her filmography or something that she wouldn't usually be attracted to, but actually she's quite prominent within sci-fi. And I would argue her most interesting work takes place within the genre. And one thing I find interesting about her work in particular in sci-fi is that her roles in films like Hair, Ghost in the Shell, Under the Skin in particular, she adopts an external version of femininity, if you like. So the idea is that what we see on screen, it's a physical form, but it's hiding her true identity. And that's what we're going to look at with Under the Skin, and how through the film basically Jonathan Glazer provides a discourse on how we perceive women in media, but also how we perceive men in media and film as well. So a key theory to understand representation of gender is Laura Mulvey's visual pleasure and narrative cinema. So it was released in the early 70s, and it's become a seminal text, and it's led to, well, it's a psychoanalytical text, so it ties into Auteur and everything we've talked about for Vertigo, but it also it provides a good frame for understanding how people and genders are represented and the power dynamics of that. Now, we're not using this PowerPoint or this essay to critique Mulvey. There are critiques of her theory online and on my website, which you can search for, but today we're going to look at the theory and how it applies to this particular film, or rather how it's been used. So Mulvey does argue that female characters in films are just bodies. Basically, they're just a physical body that male filmmakers project their fantasy onto. And as this is psychoanalytical, Mulvey says that is not contained within cinema, it's a reflection of society as a whole. So the argument being that women are basically placeholders for male sexual fantasy. They're just a body that men project fantasy onto. And the most obvious, or one of the clearest examples that, or the mediums that allows that to happen the most, is cinema, obviously, because it's such a strong visual medium. So filmmakers can use many techniques to construct the ideal fantasy female, and this obviously applies to men as well, but in constructing a fantasized or ideal representation of a gender, you can use these techniques: makeup, hair, costume, camera. So obviously camera is very important with the male gaze, script, and performance. Right, so all these things can be manipulated by a filmmaker to construct a character. And that's what we're going to look at in this PowerPoint, how Glazer constructs the female character. Okay, and just a warning on Laura Mulvey. Sometimes students argue, well, I don't find X attractive, therefore the theory falls apart. It's about intent. Okay, so you're looking for the intent of the filmmaker. There's a lot of naked imagery in this film, but you have to ask your question, is Johansson's body being eroticized, or is actually something else going on? Is the director drawing our attention to something? So that's what we're going to look at. Okay, so I suggest you watch the opening scene of the film. It's about 7 minutes long, and that's the opening all the way until Johansson has picked, or they found the body, and she's got dressed, and she is about to go to the shopping centre. So if you watch that scene, it's linked in the description, and then I'll run through some key talking points. Okay. So I think the first thing to think about is it's a film deeply rooted in sci-fi. And the very first shot, I would say, is a homage to the opening shot of 2001, or part of the opening montages of 2001: A Space Odyssey, probably the most famous and seminal sci-fi film. And the reason I say that is because we have a round image that, over the course of the montage, it's revealed that we're seeing the planets form, or at least we're seeing, I would interpret it as someone entering our solar system, but we see a body of planets. Another thing that's interesting about the first shot is that it's a spotlight, basically. Now, in the narrative, it works as it's the sun, basically. I think that's what we're seeing. But from an ideological point of view, we, the spectator, are under a director's spotlight, and he's reflecting back at us the objectification of women in film and media, and that's going to be our central thread for this particular essay. Now, as I'll just stress again, you haven't got to agree with the director's message, but what you have to do is identify it and apply an approach to it. Okay, so we see abstract images slowly form into a solar system, and that transitions into a human eye. That's an extreme close-up, and it's interesting that over the visual image of the eye form, and we hear Johansson's alien saying words, and she is basically learning the language, so she is becoming human. And I think it's very important to state or stress at this point, she's not human. The alien is not human, it's an alien, it's something other. So everything it does on Earth as a woman, we can analyse and pick apart, and we can argue that that's about performance. So again, we get the eye, which is a iconic image of sci-fi, and as you can see on screen, there's loads of examples, but it's an iconic image, and it introduces the theme of identity, which is going to be central to this film and this essay. But also more specifically, the identity creation. Okay, so we're seeing the creation of the alien, basically, and it's being created as a female. I think it's very interesting that one of the words that Johansson repeats in order to learn the language is film. So again, I think there's something quite meta going on. The director's making very, very overt attempts to draw our attention to the fact that the film is constructed, and the film is actually critiquing film and the audience, basically. Okay, so in the opening, then we have an opening montage. Now, some of the points on the screen link to binary opposition, so I'll talk about that, but we'll come back to it more for narrative. But the first shot is of the motorcyclist drive through the countryside in search of something. So he arrives, gets off the motorbike. He finds the woman in the little valley or off the side of the road, and it's interesting that the first physical image of the film depicts women as victims, okay, and they're the victims of men. They're discarded, abused, and used. So straight away we get a binary opposition, and what that means is that we get a clear opposition and juxtaposition between genders, male and female. And in the opening scene, that would be male as active, powerful, and a victimizer, whereas the female is passive, powerless, and she is a victim, and she is victimized. So an ideological expression already being expressed is that female body is just that, a body, and no persona attached. It's a thing to be used and shaped by men, and that's what we see in the next scene. Okay, so if you watch the next sequence where the alien, who I think I'll just refer to as Laura from now on, she strips the other person naked and adopts the clothes. Okay, so the passivity of the female is reinforced here, as the body, clearly alive, cannot move or resist the treatment she faces. So we've got a tear running down the face, and my interpretation of this would be that this character is not a random victim, but it is an alien, and Johansson is a replacement, because the original alien sort of went off track, or off the reservation, so to speak, which happens in the film to Laura. So it's easy to say, oh, well, this is a female character and she is active within the scene. But what you must remember throughout the film is that the motorcycle characters are always in the background. So any decision Laura seems to make that may seem active, it's maybe considered passive, actually, until she starts thinking for herself. Okay, so as you can see, both females appear naked in the scene. And, you know, if you look at a film like Michael Bay or a more contemporary mainstream filmmaker, there will be a temptation to linger on the body, close-ups. It definitely wouldn't be in black and white silhouette. I think there's an attempt to present the body in a naturalistic way as possible. And the camera's quite far away, and it's never focusing in on specific body parts. So we start to see what is called the visual regime of the film established straight away. Is that yes, there's going to be an exploration of femininity, the female body, but the director's really trying to not eroticize the body. So the alien strips the body down. And, you can argue, well, the alien's just stripping the clothes off the character so she fits into society. Yeah, that's what's happening in the narrative. But ideologically speaking, she's taking clothes off which are gender signifiers and she's adopting them. So you have this blank canvas, what Mulvey says, she's just a body and she is adopting signifiers of femininity. And the reason she's doing that is so she can fit in and appeal to men. It's an alien. It wouldn't understand what fashion was, gender roles necessarily. So the alien could just wear wherever she wants, but this is an expression that in order to attract men, for heterosexual women, there are rules basically, and we have to follow them. Okay, so that sequence is then continued that theme and ideology is continued in the next scene. So the alien strips the female of her clothes, thereby removing her identity. She puts on the clothes and adopts the gender signifiers of femininity. So she has high heels, short skirts, tight clothes. So not only is she just adopting clothes, but she's eroticizing herself in doing that. Why a short skirt? Why high heels? Why tight clothes? You have to ask yourself these questions. These aren't arbitrary choices. The director has chosen mise en scène to express an idea, and it's that women eroticize themselves as well. The alien watches over women in the mall and then copies their behavior. So we see these montage of people looking at fur coats, makeup, and basically things to do with feminine gender expression. So she's not an individual here, rather she's conforming to the expectations of those around her and surrounding gender. If she did not, she would stand out and be unable to attract men. So as we said, she's not putting on the makeup because she wants to. She's not buying these clothes and going through these regimes because she wants to. It's because society demands it if she is to fit in and be considered, quote, normal. So gender then is, the ideological expression is this, that gender is a constructed identity that's imposed upon us and that one we self-impose. We do adopt gender signifiers to conform to what is expected of us, and those signifiers are limited and people who do not conform to them are seen as outsiders, which is a theme explored in more depth later in the film. So again, this is the expression the message being expressed in the film. It's up to you to identify that and explore it. Now, you can feel free to disagree with the overall argument about gender being a construction. There's clearly a lot of grey area and a lot of debate to be had, but that is the intent of the film, and your job is to identify that and then see how that applies in the real world. Okay, so after we've established our female character and we've established the fact that she is ultimately passive and she adopts the female signifiers to fit in, we move on to develop that idea by Glazer. Okay, so if you want to watch the next scene, where it's the first scene where the alien Laura is walking or driving around the streets looking for male victims. And what's interesting is that we can talk about representation of men and maybe how the gaze, so to speak, has been flipped or at least subverted to make a comment. All right, so in this scene, we see the alien and we see lots of female POV shots of men. Men are isolated. So I think if we see this type of thing, this sequence in a film from a male perspective, we don't bat an eyelid, and the women would generally be eroticized, or at least, the women would be picked out for physical characteristics, shall we say. And we don't think anything of it. And when we watch this film, students sometimes, it's quite jarring that we just get these random shots of men. Now, technically, in terms of, the way film is constructed, and that nothing unusual is happening at all. We've seen this a million times already, but the very fact it's men stands out. And what that should tell you straight away is that you're not used to seeing men depicted like this, or seeing the world through a female point of view. And that on its own is a point. If that stands out, that's definitely something worth noting in your essay. But we do have prominent female POV shots throughout the film, and that's unusual. And what we can say about the men in the scene is that they're not being eroticized, but they're being hunted. She's active within the scene and is progressing the narrative. The men are passive and under her control, and the voyeuristic nature of the sequence is not unusual. However, the voyeur as female is. Okay, so those 3 points there, being active, men are passive, and it's voyeuristic. That's bog standard Hollywood construction. Think of our study of Vertigo, Madeline. She literally doesn't speak, she's just a thing we gaze at. But we wouldn't describe that as hunting women. We describe it as eroticization, romance. The range is there, but when it's flipped, it has this sinister connotation of hunting. So what Glazer's doing really is drawing our attention to how films are constructed, and he's throwing it back at us. He's saying, why do you find this strange with men? You do this all the time with women, but now it's men, it's strange. So there's where the ideological critique is. So traditionally, women are the object of the gaze, and they are the victim of voyeurism, but here the roles are reversed and it feels unusual. And that's because a female point of view, male objectification and passive males are not what we expect. We expect to see traditional representations of gender. So Glazer switches binary oppositions, positioning the female as active bearer of the gaze and men as passive victims. Okay, so the ideological expression is that film is a masculine domain where women are objectified, and Glazer is using the science fiction genre and one of the biggest film stars in the world to draw our attention to that. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead in the film and look at a few sequences. So there are 3 main sequences where the alien seduces male characters. So we have Man 1, Man 2, and then we have the disfigured man, which we'll talk about separately. So the alien understands that her body is pleasurable to men, and she uses it to ensnare them. So again, the alien, as we see later in the film, she has no innate sexual desire. She has no sex drive, so to speak. She has no real desire for men, because remember, she's not human. So you have to think about, she's basically, the way we look at ants or something like that, it's the same thing. However, but she does understand that her body is something she can use to ensnare and trap men. But any pleasure from her body is taken by men, not her. Okay, so there is an element that she's active, but she's continually objectified by men, and these sequences reflect that. So if you look at the differences in the male and female bodies, I hope I'm not being unfair, but the male actors who get naked are just, let's say, relatively average, normal people. But then you've got Scarlett Johansson, like the supermodel, A-list actress in front of that. So again, there is an element there of that the body is on screen for for male pleasure, but that's juxtaposed with what Scarlett Johansson's doing in the film, is that using her body to trap and ensnare men. So there's a lot going on there about both genders and representation. Okay, so the first 2 go, to plan, and we see these poor, pathetic men drawn into Johansson. And when I say poor and pathetic, I don't mean just because they're victims. It's because their situation there in life, they're clearly quite vulnerable, and they've been hunted and picked off again, right? So again, like women in film, it's just flipped. Okay, so the alien understands that body's pleasurable. But let's have a look. Okay, so again, this point about, although she has got some control, ultimately the control of her body and how she uses it is overseen by a male, because after this sequence we see the motorcyclists inspect the alien's thoughts. So clearly the male character is in a position of authority and has control not over her body but her mind as well. Okay, so up until this point in the film, I think it's fair to say that we have a film that flips or juxtaposes the traditional approaches to gender, and the reason Jonathan Glazer has done that is to reflect back on us how we construct and how we consume media, and he's pointing out that women are eroticized and there is a difference between men and women, and he's critiquing that. But up until this point, I'd say the alien is pretty much just the alien. She's on track, and it's only when she meets the disfigured man that she starts to become a bit more of an individual. So ideologically speaking, the alien has just conformed to many expectations of women, and she's using how we construct gender to her advantage. But throughout the film, she encounters a large variety of human beings and human experiences. So she experiences empathy. So when she's talking to the disfigured man and when she falls over in the street, I think she really sees empathy and vulnerability for the first time. And she sees love and laughter in other people and a variety of ages and ethnicities. And this is where we get to see more shots of women. So she's taken in the human experience rather than a gendered one. And she realizes that humans are extremely complex individuals, a fact not considered in the representation of women. You look at the images on screen, there are so many different types of people, men and women, different ages and ethnicities, that, the alien herself is noticing, actually, this is much more complex than what I've been told. So this changes the alien, which is visualized by this transition as she's driving around. So they have this strange orange overlay over the screen, and that sort of visually represents a transition. So she has learned that people are complex, layered, and individual, and not simply definable by two labels of men and women. So basically, she understands this gender construction is just surface level, and people are much, much more complex. Okay. And that's exacerbated by when she's in the van and she's attacked. She starts to feel your human vulnerability and fear, and she starts to become more human, basically. Okay, so the disfigured man's key for this. So both the man and the alien are defined by their skin and their body or the way they look. Okay, so both are viewed surface level. You're just a body, and what can I take from it? But because of the disfigured man, he does not conform to one of the expected norms or expectations, so he's an outcast from society. The alien empathizes with the situation and shares his sense of being undervalued solely by their bodies. Okay, so both characters connect because they both realize that their only value to other people is their body. The way in which the way in which we ascribe, adopt, and reinforce social roles that define us is exposed by the filmmaker here, as the two characters, defined by their bodies, express how this makes them feel, or, as in reference to the title, they start to realise what's under the skin. The alien lets him go because she's becoming more human, more complex and individualised as she struggles with the limiting nature of the gender she has adopted. So visually, the audiences are presented with two images of the alien. And mirrors used to signify inner conflict or the notion that a person is reflecting on what they are. And that reference to the mirror is after she lets the disfigured man go, she stares in the mirror, and we get that little moment with the fly trapped between the panes. So again, a visual metaphor is that she's starting to realise that she's more than just a body, and actually this society she's in is suffocating her because of that. Okay. So I would say the second part or second half of the film is when the alien attempts to escape her, the constructed nature or a constructed identity. So she attempts to live a life as normal. She tries to eat food. She tries to listen to music. She attempts to fall in love. And whilst alone, she explores her own body and then attempts to have sex with her Prince Charming character. So what I'd suggest now is that you go back and watch some clips from the film where she escapes on the bus. She tries to eat food, the scene with the Prince Charming character, the man who takes her home from the bus, all the way through the attempted sex scene until the escape. And we will start thinking about how the ideological expression is developed. Okay. So I haven't really included much on the sequence where she goes with the man from the bus because I want you to sort of have your own thoughts on that one. Because I think within the narrative it's seen as this guy's a good guy and he's a bit of a Prince Charming who's looking after her. However, that may be a male point of view to look at it. If I was a young woman and I was that vulnerable and a guy was showing that interest and took me home, you could say, oh yeah, he's looking after you. But the fact that he attempts to have sex with the alien, even though she instigates it, the fact he goes through with it, I think says something about him and his intent. So it's up to you. I want you to think about what you can say about men and women there. And maybe I'm looking into it. Maybe he's just a good guy. But it's up to you. And again, your own experiences will feed into that. But what I will say is watch the sequence where the alien or Johansson strips in front of the mirror. Because it's the only time where I would say we get closest to what you term the male gaze or the eroticization of the female body. And what I find interesting about it is that we have the music by Michael Levy. And we do have close-ups and pan and shots of her body. And yes, it's a male director, but at that moment the character seems to be, for the first time ever, taking pleasure in her own body. So that's a point that you need to sort of come to terms with and have a think about. Is this just pure exploitation of Johansson being naked, or is a genuine story or narrative or character moment being employed? Okay, so after that, the alien runs away. And what's interesting actually in the sex scene is that she tries to, and she instigates a sex scene, but ultimately she hasn't. I think the intention is she hasn't got any reproductive organs or genitalia. So I think that's one of the ultimate statements in this film is that even though after Johansson or the alien realizes she's human, she's a body, she's valuable, even then when she's fully actualized, if you like, and a human being, not just a body, even then, in this society, her body, she can't take pleasure herself. It's only men or other people can take pleasure in it. And that's such a damning statement by Glazer. Okay, so after that, the alien runs away, obviously conflicted, and she runs away and she hides in the woods. And I think this is where the final, well, it's obviously the final statement, but the strongest statement in the film comes. So the alien, having attempted to become more human, more complex, and something more than just her body, is at the end reduced to just that, a body for male pleasure. So all the way through the film, or the second half of the film, the alien is attempting to break away from the socially constructed roles that we have for men and women around gender and sex. And she does that to a certain extent. She becomes human. She becomes a person with emotions and choices. She starts to listen to music, or at least try to fit in. But even when she wants to use her body for her own pleasure, she can't, because it's ultimately constructed by a man. So when she escapes, that reality is really brought home in one of the starkest and grimmest endings of a film you'll ever see. So she's alone in the woods, and she wakes up to a worker masturbating over her, basically, and groping her. She is reduced once again to a thing, an object. And the fact she's asleep is just so much more sinister. And then she runs away and she's chased by the man. And what the man sees is he rips the skin basically and sees the alien underneath. So instead of trying to understand or even just running away, what the man does, instead of trying to understand it, he destroys her. And the film ends with an image of men in pursuit of women. So the motorcyclists are still after her. Because she did not conform to the expectations of the men around her, and she's brutally burned to death for it. So basically, the end, because she has not conformed to this patriarchal society and done what is expected of her, she's burned to death. Okay, so the film is not presenting a utopian solution. Like true sci-fi, it ends in a dystopian way, and the film is reflecting back on us, our current time, and how we view women in and represent women in media. Okay, so through the use of genre and star power, and that is so important, this film would only really work with someone of Johansson's, let's say, fame. I think it has to be her in this film for this discourse to work and be so powerful. And basically it ends with as a discourse on how society looks at women. So to sum her up, the alien adopts traditional feminine gender signifiers and uses her body to attract men. This may appear to be a statement about feminine sexuality and empowerment. However, following closer consideration of the film, we realise that she is just a body. We're not provided with her own motivation or her desires or her thoughts. We don't learn anything about her. And again, that argument about a woman hunting men, yes, it's empowering. I think it's a very surface level reading, because if you really consider it in a narrative level, she is being controlled by the motorcycle characters who are men. And again, it's interesting, isn't it, that they're not really men. They adopted male characteristics when the alien came to Earth. So, even the aliens are showing us that they understand the difference. So later in the film, as she escapes, she becomes more human, more complex, and something more than just a body. Okay, so she becomes a human. She starts to develop empathy, desires, fear, and she has a own wants. She pursues a sexual relationship with the man on the bus, remember, not the other way around. But ultimately, she can't. She's just an object still. And I think something we haven't talked about, but is just as important, is that, within society, women are expected maybe to fulfill certain roles, and it's the same in cinema. And the alien conforms to this, cannot conform to that. She can't be a love interest because she's got no genitalia. We see the scene on the beach. We see a baby after its parents have been swept out to sea crying, and she just walks past it and walks past and leaves it. So she's not a love interest, she's not a mother, and she can't be a sex object. And if a woman in a narrative or in society is not one of those three things under the patriarchal society, then she's destroyed. And that is what Glazer is saying. Okay, so ultimately the film ends with men destroying women who do not conform to their expectation and their demand. So that is the meaning of Under the Skin from an ideological critical approach, looking at gender. And obviously, it's just talking over the video, and it's just getting ideas out there. There's a lot more to say, and we'll address this when we return to college. But part of your activity or your task today is to watch this video, make notes, and then develop those ideas on your own. So if you've got any questions, email me, view our website, and you can be in touch.